We are looking forward our way from Studio C in the 511 studios in the Brewery District, just south of downtown Columbus, Ohio. Hi, this is Brett. Carol and I are in the studio with our guests coming to us remotely. Let's first welcome Dr. Phyllis Cummins. Phyllis is a senior research scholar at the Scripps Gerontology Center at my alma mater, Miami University of Ohio. Phyllis is also a fellow for the Gerontological Society of America. Our second guest is Dr. Phillip Taylor, professor at the Institute of Employment Research at the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. Phillip is also a fellow for the Gerontological Society of America and the associate editor of Aging and Society, as well as the convener of the Aging Workforce Interest Group for the Gerontological Society of America. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you both so much for being with us today. Brett and I have had a lot of opportunities to advocate for older adults and demonstrate the value that they bring to an employer. But today we welcome our two guests who are both experts in workforce development and the impact of aging. We're going to dive into this research, which has been conducted not only in the United States, but also in England and Australia. But first, we want to have our guests introduce themselves and provide us with some of their background in workforce development. Phillip, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So I began researching issues of older workers at the end of the 1980s. If anybody can remember the 1980s, I was researching older workers back then. And this is a really interesting subject, I think, because we could talk at length about the history of older workers and the issue of older workers. And the past is a fascinating one because a lot of the discussions that we're having today, we were having 40 years ago on this topic. And I think that's an important lesson. What we know about the past of older workers and how that frames our thinking about what to do today about this issue. And a lot of the debates we're having today are very familiar to me because we were having the same debates in the 1980s. So it's great to be here talking about this with you today.
Thank you. Phyllis, how about you?
Well, I first became interested in the topic of older workers when I was working on my dissertation at Miami University. I'm an older worker myself, and studying gerontology and becoming a researcher at Scripps Gerontology Center is a second career for me. But I was working on my dissertation toward the tail end of the Great Recession, and I became very interested in the impacts of that recession on older workers because they tended to be unemployed for longer periods of time, and it became difficult for them to re-enter the workforce, and a lot of them needed additional training. So during the past 10 years, as a Scripps researcher, my real interest has been in older workers, their place in the workplace, and the importance of ongoing training so that they can remain employed if they so desire.
There are an incredible number of issues at stake in this field of research. Today, we're going to hone in on two major challenges. One, how does an employer ensure candidates have an equal opportunity to gain employment and ensure every company stakeholder is trained to create a culture of fair recruiting, hiring, and retention? And secondly, why employers should ensure their workforce is properly trained, focusing on their abilities and learning capacity, creating a more efficient and effective company. Phillip, we should start with an understanding of the role older adults play in a workforce. Also, why are so many retirees looking to return to paid employment?
That's a really good question, Brett. And the issues are multifaceted around this. We have an aging society, and in Australia, in the UK, in the USA, Japan, Europe, our societies are aging, and it's long been recognized that people will need to work for longer in order that governments are concerned about this through Social Security. They don't want to be paying out Social Security to people, an increasingly aging population. They want us to work. And that's driven a lot of thinking amongst policymakers internationally about this issue. The rising cost of social welfare, and governments want to minimize that cost. Hey, let's get older workers, let's get older people to work for as long as possible. And that, frankly, has driven much thinking in this space. But on top of that, it's increasingly recognized that productive activities, active aging, if you will, is talked about a lot. That's good for us. People want to participate in society. They feel a need to participate in society. These issues have aligned beautifully in the last few decades. So governments want us to work for longer, and we want to work for longer as well, because we know that it's good for us. Doing something is good for us. And we know as well at the moment that many employers are struggling to find labour. And again, this is an international problem. And hey, there's a pool of potential workers out there who have valuable skills and capabilities that they can deploy, and they want to work. And so there's potentially a good marriage there between older people and businesses that are crying out for labour. And this isn't just an issue in the US, it's an international problem, this problem of shortfalls in labour supply, as we call it.
That's interesting that you pull in the international. I'm glad you're here to speak to that, because we can only look at ourselves here in the U.S. that it's actually an international problem. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Japan, if you think about Japan, South Korea, very aged societies. And there's huge anxiety about what they're going to do about those aging populations, because one thing they don't do in Japan and Korea is migration. And migration's been something of a savior for the UK and also the USA and continental Europe. But Japan and South Korea don't do immigration in the same way that we do. So they've got to do much more with less. And that's causing huge challenges in those countries.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the notion of how employers combat ageism in their organization. We've heard stories of age discrimination in hiring and retention practices. I often say that ageism is the only ism that seems to be allowed and that people get away with here. It seems that it's rampant. Employers consistently discuss their commitment to equity and fairness, but we don't often see that in the hiring process. What should employers be looking for in their organization to make sure they are actually combating ageism?
Carol, thanks for the question. And you're right, it's from both a hiring perspective and then a retention in the workplace. And I think it's important that it comes from the top down, that ageism is not acceptable, but senior management conveys to their hiring manager and all the way down to managers that ageism in the workplace is not acceptable, because as Philip mentioned, there are worker shortages now. So we need workers of all ages to be available. And so to combat ageism in the workplace, it's important that hiring managers really understand age discrimination laws. Some employers may be afraid to interview older adults because if the older adult is not hired, they might face litigation. But they can, one way to get around that is by having age-blind review of resumes, applications and resumes. And then in job postings, be careful, employers need to be careful that they don't have ageist language in their job postings, such as digital natives only need apply. Um, I've read of several examples of employers actually putting that in job postings. There's also been research that when, say, someone sent in 100 resumes and that it was obvious that those that were obviously older workers didn't get a call back, whereas others did get a call back. So just the whole idea of trying to age blind reviewing applications and resumes. But it's also important for older adults seeking new employment to take some responsibility in their job seeking efforts. Now, I hear stories about resumes filled with errors, and the older adult not taking time to really do a thoughtful and careful review of the resumes, and then they blame their age rather than their errors in their resume on why they aren't hired. And some adults also have self-imposed attitudes of self-imposed ageism that, oh, they won't hire me. So they go into an interview with that attitude. So it's what happens then. So it's important when, say, an older adult applies for a job that they make sure that they have the skills that the employer's looking for. And if they don't have those skills, to get some training so they do have the skills, because I think it's an indication to an employer that if I think they call it signaling, like if I can show that I've learned new skills, that is important to an employer in hiring because it's an indication that they can learn and be productive. But training in the workplace is training about ageism in the workplace is also important, so that and not for all employees, not just hiring managers or managers, because just ageist language like calling somebody honey or dear, that doesn't work well. I had a doctor that I went to once, and she said to me, "Oh, you're 70 years young." And this is a doctor, and I'm thinking, does she really know that that's an ageist thing to say? But anyway, I think just education about ageist language and offering older workers the same opportunities for promotion and professional development is important. There's been some research that older adults just aren't given the same training opportunities, and I think we'll probably discuss that later. But I think it's important that older adults take advantage before they're hired of upskilling.
I was talking to a group of college students the other day, and one of the tips that I gave them, I actually just realized I could give to my older adult job seekers, and that is when someone offers you an opportunity, don't say no. Say yes, take a breath, and figure it out.
Yeah, I think thank you. And I think what Phyllis says is great. I wanted to add to it with a couple of things. Just an example of ageism in action. I did a project in Australia recently, and we were looking at ageism in universities. And I won't name the university, it would be indelicate. But they offered an early retirement scheme to workers aged 50. So the university assumed that people were over the hill at the age of 50, which I thought was truly remarkable. And Phyllis mentioned signaling, and we wrote about what the existence of that scheme signaled to workers who were aged in their 40s. Mm-hmm. It signaled that you were nearly old. So watch out, because quite soon you will be old. You'll be 50, and that was one example. But there were others that had schemes targeting older workers in their 50s. So not as young as 50, but maybe 55. But it's out there and it's real. I would say though that I often think we need to be quite careful in arguing that ageism is lurking behind every tree, because I'm not always so convinced of that. And I would say, going on from what Phyllis said, that older workers sometimes internalize ageism. I'm too old to train, or I'm too old to get a job. No one would hire me. And I'd say here that we often will single out employers for particular attention here. You're being ageist. But I would plead some caution. I think in advocacy and also in government policy, I've observed a tendency towards ageism as well. So I think the problem is, if anything, I think we should characterize it as being a societal problem and not just say it's you employers that are at fault. I think there's a bigger picture here as society about how we talk about older workers, what the public discourse is around aging, if that makes sense. So I think I see ageist advocacy, a well-meaning advocacy on targeting older people, but advocacy that is ageist. And so I think it's something that we all need to reflect upon, and it's not just a problem of employers, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I gave a presentation to a group of approximately 100 people, and this gentleman at the end got up and said he was the perfect candidate for the job and he didn't get it because he was too old. So my question to him was, do you know who got the job? And he said no. And I said, so you have no clue as to that possibly that person is one day older than you. We make assumptions based on what we hear or what we think we're hearing from other folks. If it's in an interview, if you are employed by someone and you're having conversations with peers or other managers or supervisors, that you have to carefully listen and make sure you're not assuming there is an ism in that conversation. Don't assume ahead of time.
Sorry, Carol, I interrupted you. If come back on that, because I think it's a really good point. I'm reminiscent. I'm reminded of a report from the Stanford Longevity Center that a line sticks with me from this report, referring to the wisdom of older people and the energy of youth. And I thought, well, what about the wisdom of younger people and the energy of older people? And I thought that this report, drawing directly from age stereotypes, and I was frankly astonished. And I think messaging is really important. And so that's my point. Let's not just view this as old employers being the problem, because I think it's more of a societal thing and how we talk about aging. Another quick point, if I may. Ageism is a really interesting topic, and age discrimination is. Did you know that in Australia and also in European countries, our age discrimination legislation can apply at any age, not just as with the ADEA over 40. So a young person can claim age discrimination too. So I think it is worth reflecting upon whether we shouldn't open out the discussion a little bit so we can involve younger people in a conversation about ageism. Because when I've spoken at events about ageism and talked about ageism and young people, with young people present, they will come up to me and say, yes, I'm really pleased you've spoken about this because no one talks about it. We experience it too. And I think involving young people in the dialogue around ageism is really powerful.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that message, because we hear from young people often that you're not listening to me. You're not taking what I say seriously because I'm young. Great. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, Philip, mature job candidates often look for positions that are different than they previously held. They may not want to manage staff anymore. They prefer fewer hours or maybe flexible schedules. Have employers successfully recruited and retained older workers through innovative programs such as targeted benefits packages to more closely meet those specific needs?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely. I mean, a number of employers internationally come to mind. Redesign of jobs, putting in health service, particular health services for workers to meet their changing needs and so on. Flexible deployment options, flexible retirement options. So you could say part-time retire. You could gradually retire. So there are there are lots of mechanisms that are being deployed internationally by businesses in this space. I would come back to what you say. I think that there are assumptions about what older people need, and there's a discussion we should have today is what's an older worker, because I think that's an interesting question in itself. At what point do you become old? But I think that for me, it's often the case, though, that for instance, with carers returning to the world of work in their late 50s, they may want a full-time job. They may be building their career at that point, and they may want to be taking on extra responsibility. So I think we should be wary of possibly veering into assumptions about what older people might want later on in a career or at older ages. So yes, there's a lot out there, I think, in terms of good workplace policy in this space. But on the other hand, I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that older workers might want to begin to retire gradually, or that they necessarily have particular needs that need to be addressed. If that makes sense, Brett?
Yeah, I think maybe a good example of this is my daughter just started a new position, and one of the perks is unlimited personal time off. But there are some caveats. Obviously, they kind of put some guardrails to it to a certain degree, suggesting, really only X amount of time, but it is stated that way. And then I got to talking about that philosophy with a couple other business owners, and they said, yeah, there's been research that you can offer the unlimited, but it's never taken. So it's that, okay, unlimited PTO, it could be good for any age. It comes down to if it's taken or not. It's okay, offer it to everybody. It may fit. It's a non-age thing, but it's there, and probably most people aren't going to take it.
Quite so, and I think it's the devil is in the detail of these policies, and it's all very well having a policy, but if no one takes it up, it's not much of a policy really. Yeah. One interesting thing that I was reminded of was policies to encourage people to work past the age of 65 in some countries. While there seems to be interest amongst older workers in working on, for many workers, that age of 65 seems to be a bit of a barrier. It's changing, but nonetheless, 65 seems to be a bit of a line for many workers, and so employers may be keen to keep them past that age, but for many workers, it does seem to be a bit of a barrier. But I think that is changing gradually. Social norms around working and retiring are adjusting, but still people are still thinking, I'm in my early 60s. I'm getting near the time now, at least in many countries, maybe not in the USA, but in many of the countries I know.
There are examples of positions in which retirement is mandatory, such as pilots, commercial pilots. I think 65 or 70 is the mandatory age, and the pilots who have been forced to retire are bringing up issues and trying to get past that. So there's really it's that ageism is from both perspectives, pushing people into retirement, forcing them into retirement. That we need to, as you said, we need to better understand the issues that are going on, not from a perspective of how old somebody is, but from a perspective of what do they want to do and what can they do, and how can we accommodate everyone regardless of age, background, experience, education, whatever that may be. Is that, am I interpreting this correctly?
I'm surprised, Carol, we haven't spoken about octogenarian presidents yet.
Let's not.
Let's don't.
It's going to be a long year in the U.S. Phyllis, please.
I think that it's an interesting area to discuss, but perhaps another podcast.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
I wanted to talk a little more about flexible work arrangements, because I think since the start of the pandemic, work arrangements have really changed a lot. And it's not just older adults that might want flexible work arrangements. Some might, but you've got people with young children, or that their kids are involved in sports activities. And some of the things that have come out of the pandemic, where remote work is more common, and they can take off a couple hours during the day to go to a sporting event or a doctor's appointment, and then make it up later at night if they need to. So I think there have been quite a few benefits from the pandemic. Certainly they're not all great, but I think work arrangements have really changed, and it's flexible work arrangements aren't important just for older adults, but for people of all ages that have other responsibilities. And I think it's been good for employers and employees that this change has happened.
We have an age advocate here in Columbus who always says, and has taught us well, that whatever is good for an older person is likely good for a younger person. Whether that be a flexible schedule or a covered, sheltered bus stop, whatever that may be. But it seems that this really goes back to the issue of redefining or reevaluating job descriptions, job requirements, and job tasks. Because if if somebody is on an assembly line, they aren't going to get a flexible schedule. The assembly line is going to continue with or without them at their post, and if they're not there, then there's going to be a problem on that assembly line. But if it's a position that there is flexibility in when the work happens, then flexibility in a schedule is more likely to happen also. Is that really what we need to focus on, Philip?
Yeah, I'm just on assembly lines in particular. BMW several years ago now implemented an assembly line that was staffed solely by older workers, and to huge effect, and it was very, very successful. And I would say, with exceptions like fighter pilots and things like that, I think to a large extent, age is unrelated to one's ability to do a job. Mm-hmm. There are there are always exceptions to the rule, like military pilots, for instance. But nonetheless, I think on the whole, we should argue, we should advocate that age shows relatively little relationship with job performance. And I think that's a really powerful message. And it's not that older workers are better than younger ones. It's that age really shouldn't matter and doesn't matter, in fact.
Very true. And going back to that assembly line, BMW had to make some changes to make that work, correct?
Yes, yeah. but relatively modest, relatively low cost changes.
Exactly.
That assembly line functioned as well as an assembly line with younger workers, and so for relatively low cost, we can affect changes in organisations that can have a dramatic impact on people's ability to work on. So these interventions are not necessarily hugely costly, but they can have a massive impact on organisations.
Correct. And I know there was an assembly line change in a auto manufacturer, and I'm not sure if it was the one at BMW or another one, where they literally, the only thing that really needed to happen was that the assembly line platform was raised. It was higher to accommodate issues, and it accommodated the issues for a worker of any age. I mean, nobody wants to stoop over in their work. And so it really is an issue of rethinking the task, evaluating the task and how it can be more efficient, more effective, and easier, or I don't want to even use the word easier, but better for the worker to perform. And age is not part of that decision making.
Yeah, I mean,
it doesn't need to be.
If I may come in, I think it's important to consider the downstream consequences of jobs on workers. So an older worker doesn't just get a bad back suddenly at the age of 56. That bad back has been coming for many years. And so if we can help, if we can intervene in terms of the quality of people's jobs much earlier in a career, it can mean that a person can work for much longer. But we know the evidence is quite clear that certainly in the UK that one of the big drivers of early retirement is ill health. And so if we can intervene earlier in a career, we can perhaps head off that critical driver of people's withdrawal from the world of work.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Phyllis, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next topic, which salary is always a very critical issue for everyone. That is a critical issue for our job candidates. How can an employer ensure that they are maintaining equitable salary levels for all candidates as well as their staff? And are salary packages critical to retaining qualified staff?
Well, salary packages are important to people of all ages across their working lives. And they should be based on experiences and responsibilities of the employee, regardless of age. In many employment situations, salaries and salary packages are public. I work for Miami University, and it may be a year or two old that people can look up what I make at Miami University. And I think that's true of all public employees. Ohio State's data are actually more current. And people talk. People have some sense for what other employees in the organization are making. They talk, and there's organizations such as Glassdoor where you could get some sense for what employees with the other employees with the same responsibilities or what their income is. So it's important that employers keep on top of what they need to pay, not just in salary, but overall packages to retain their employees, to be competitive. But it's important that someone at the same level in an organization and the same level of productivity should make roughly the same amount, regardless of seniority. I know people that have been around a long time, they get pay increases, but it should even out somewhat over time. And if, say, an older worker or a younger worker, maybe they have the same job responsibilities, but they're not as productive, and so maybe they don't get as much of an increase in their next review. It's important to document if they're not as productive, why they're not as productive, so that employers can protect themselves, because not everybody is as productive. In some cases, an older employee might prefer to have fewer responsibilities. We talked a little bit about that in flexible work arrangements. Maybe in the past, they've supervised a lot of people, but maybe they don't want that stress any longer of supervising people. And they might want a less stressful work situation. And in those situations, the older worker would really need to understand that they're not going to make the same as what they have previously, or what others in the organization might make that have those additional responsibilities.
Well, employers once spend significant dollars on training, but that benefit's not readily available now, or just it's lost focus. However, training access plays a major role in today's workforce. Positions and tasks are constantly changing, so the skills of current employees they must be upgraded. Job candidates walk into interviews frantic to demonstrate that they know new technologies and continue to learn more. Philip, training programs for older workers may need to be modified to fit the learning styles that work for this mature population. What role should employers fill in creating effective training opportunities? Have you found any successfully implemented, or are they kind of the same for younger workers and older workers? Maybe there's no line of demarcation there.
There is good evidence that older workers' learning styles are somewhat different from young workers. There's no doubt about that. And there are, again, examples of employers that have implemented interventions targeting the skills of older workers. And I think in one sense, that in itself is really important, because there's often an assumption that you hit the age of 60 and there's no point in investing in Brett anymore, because Brett's 60 now and Brett's going to be gone in a few years. And so let's not waste the money on investing with Brett. But Carol is in her 20s, and Carol's going to be with us for a long period of time, so we're going to invest in Carol. And so lots of assumptions are built into all of this. Brett might actually be thinking, well, I'm feeling pretty fit. I can see myself being here another 10 years. So it's investing in skills alone is a good thing, I think, because often there's an assumption from employers that it's not worth doing it. Also, older workers as well, I should stress. Older workers will say, look, I've interviewed older workers on this topic. They'll say, look, Phil, I'm nearing the end of my career. What's the point in me going back to college? And so it's really important to stress to older people who are looking for work that they need to be investing in their skills, and for people in work to invest in their skills over the long term. The world of work is changing, it's evolving, things are shifting very quickly, and we all need to be keeping our skills up to date. So I think it's not just a responsibility of employers. I think they play a critical role here, but it's also the responsibility of workers too.
I think you bring up a good point too, that there needs to be a conversation between employer and employee about where are you in this position? I mean, are you happy? You see yourself here if you're 60, you see yourself here for another 10 years? This is what we're going to, just a healthy conversation about, we want you here and we got some training that's available if you feel that you want to be here. Or maybe an older adult doesn't want to play those cards saying, nah, I'm only going to be here a couple more years, but there's got to be a way to have this conversation that you are encouraging every employee to want to stay by these opportunities that you provide.
It's a really good point. And I know anecdotally employers will sometimes say, but we're reluctant to have those conversations for fear of being accused of age discrimination. So we need to devise ways in which we can have open conversations, talking about what can we do to keep you for longer? How can we invest? What are your plans going forward as an employee? I've been told by employers, greeted my comments about older workers with incredulity. They say the people in my factory, they're done. They want to go. They don't want to stay here. And I thought to myself, if you ever asked any of them, what could be done to keep them for longer? And I suspect there's a bit of a dialogue of the deaf going on. Nobody really wants to talk about this.
Dialogue of the deaf. I love that.
It would seem, though, part of the conversation, they have to be comfortable knowing that if they say, I want to continue to work, but I don't want to do this, they have to be comfortable that the employer is going to say there are alternatives, because I may want to stay working in this organization, but I don't want to work in that physical position. But could I possibly be trained to do, I don't want to say customer service, but, a position that is not physical that they could still do? I don't know that employers have that much flexibility themselves to create positions for an individual to stay. the funding that would go into it, that kind of thing. So it seems like part of the policies that we are looking at on how we can help older adults also have to be to help employers come up with those alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you an immediate response. A firefighting organization in Spain that I'm familiar with implemented a scheme targeting older firefighters who were recognizing that their bodies were wearing out and they just couldn't what they used to do. So what they did with those workers, they moved them into training and mentoring roles. To huge success. They kept all of this capability, which hitherto would have disappeared. And it was greatly appreciated by the younger workers because they were picking up all of these skills. So there are lots of ways in which we could think imaginatively about how we deploy older workers.
Right. I can remember Phyllis mentioned working in higher education, and I was in higher education for almost 30 years. When someone retired, and needless to say, they couldn't wait to get out, but when they retired, they took with them 30, 35, 40 years of information. It wasn't the tasks that they completed. It was who they knew on campus and how to make things happen and how to get through the process easier, and all those kinds of bits and pieces of information that were lost were huge. And the organization really never recognized that problem and were willing to deal with that. So, yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Phyllis,
Carol,
did you?
Yeah, Carol, I think you brought up what I think of as institutional knowledge that we have. But there's also a networking component because through organizations, I met Philip, and I have in some of my work, I'm involved with community colleges and recruiting them to be case study schools. And I made all those contacts through networking. And a lot of that, just when I retire, that's going to go away. There's not anyone at Miami that's really doing the same kind of work that I have done, which is unfortunate. And just, I think the institutional knowledge that's lost and the networking and the importance of me mentoring someone to really take over my work, to find somebody that's interested. And I don't know if Philip has thoughts on that topic. It's a little bit off track, but
I don't think it is off track, Phyllis. This is where there's always the devil in the detail of these conversations. We also know of employers who want greenfield sites. They want green workforces. They don't want corporate knowledge because for them, corporate knowledge is the past. And we don't want the past, we want the future. And certainly in conversations I've had with employers in this space, that corporate knowledge isn't valued. And this is where it gets complicated, I think, in having conversations about these issues. It's not necessarily a case that there are ready, easy solutions that can be applied in all workplaces, because I think it's a very, very complex area. As I think we've established in our conversation over the last hour, there are lots of nuances in all of this that we need to consider. So I think corporate knowledge is valuable in certain circumstances, but not necessarily in all of them.
Philip, without putting you on the spot here, can you give me an example of when corporate knowledge would not be valuable?
It's because employers and forward-looking employers who want to be creating what they would consider to be innovative, forward-looking businesses that are maybe high-tech, for instance. And there's a concern that older workers are of the past, and we don't want to carry that past with us. We're very forward-looking. We want to be innovative. We want to be creative, and those characteristics are not necessarily associated with older workers. So all I'm saying, Carol, is I think just pleading a little bit of caution, because we might imagine that employers think that corporate knowledge is great and it's obvious, isn't it? But not necessarily, I think, for some employers. They may not value it as much as we think they ought to.
Their assumption is that corporate knowledge is old ways of doing something, not necessarily an educated look at how something has performed in the past.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
And corporate knowledge can be seen as a drag on organizational capability.
Interesting. Okay.
And this comes out of the human resource management literature. So corporate knowledge is not necessarily perceived as a corporate good.
Okay. Thank you. I had not heard that, and that's shocking to me. It shouldn't be, but it is. I want to throw one more idea in here, though, to not forget this important lesson I had. Several years ago, we had a speaker come to Columbus and discuss older workers, and she had what at that time was an innovative idea for employers, and I think particularly for larger employers, that when an individual they knew that their career was going to be coming to an end. They did want to move into something different, but as opposed to them just working their job and then suddenly gone, the employers had opportunities where they could assist this individual to hone in on what they wanted to do in their next encore career and to help them create that entity within the larger organization in such a way that it benefited the larger organization and launched the individual into their next encore career. So it was sort of giving them a transition period. Has anything like that ever come across your desk?
Yes. I mean, there's a lot come out of the US on bridge employment, bridge jobs in recent years. Right. And internationally, over my career, there's been a lot of talk about phased retirement, partial retirement, flexible retirement, lots of ways of exiting the labor force in more flexible ways. And it's undoubtedly the case that those kinds of programs benefit workers. There'll be a little, again, being a bit of a fly in the ointment in the conversation, just a bit of a plea to think about workers. Many workers don't have those flexible choices. And we know there are many kinds of jobs where that flexibility is not open to people. So the jobs where these things often apply are white collar jobs and often men's jobs, male jobs. And so that leaves out many workers who don't have access to this kind of flexibility. So for me, the question is often, is the flexibility for whom? Yeah, absolutely. These schemes have been shown to be beneficial for many workers, but I think just with that little bit of caution from me.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm going to go back to Philip's comment about the firefighters for my next question to Phyllis. That notion of that mentoring. There are individuals out there who can learn from each other. Job circles provide support. Internships provide professional development for young folks. It would seem that the lessons that we have learned from those situations can work in a corporate setting. Younger workers teaching older workers that sort of art of technology, while older workers provide young staff with insight into intricacies like that networking, the value of networking, the value of clear communications and wisdom that comes from shared experiences. Phyllis, you've looked at this a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about building those skills into training programs around opportunities such as structured mentoring?
Sure. And intergenerational training can be accomplished in a lot of different ways. And I think of, say, a project team to work on a project. You can include a diverse group, say it's a 3 or 4 or 5 person team, having an older person, a younger person, having different racial components, racial and ethnic components, so that people really become accustomed to working with different people that are different. They have different ideas and they have different skill levels. So the older person might not have the technical skills the younger person does, but the older person might have the networking. They might have life experiences that are useful. And so it can be intergenerational that way, or there could be more formal mentoring programs where an older adult is paired with a younger adult and they just mentor each other. Maybe they have lunch once a month, they have breakfast or something. And the older worker might share thoughts on workplace etiquette, the soft skills, the importance of showing up to work, how to network. And in the same way that in project teams, the younger adult, the younger worker can show the older worker social networking, like Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, all of those skills that are becoming more important in many jobs today. And also just how to use the computer more easily. Now, I recall one interview, and this was not in the workplace, it was an educational setting. We were interviewing adult students, older students, and one woman we interviewed shared that, well, her granddaughter helped her use the computer and how to do Excel and Word for her assignments, that sort of thing. So intergenerational mentoring could be outside of the workplace as well.
One of the most significant issues for older job applicants is their understanding of technology. We've kind of talked about that quite a bit here, as well as the employer's assumption of their tech skill level. Younger workers arrive at an employer with technology in their hand since they were able to walk, as we talked about that digital native. We need to come up with a different term for older adults, digital enforcer.
Innovators. We're the innovators.
Yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah, let's start that. But, tech skill levels for older adults vary across the spectrum. I mean, Phillip, what should employers understand about the technology training needs of older employees? And are there methods that have been more successful in teaching those skills?
Gosh, that's a difficult question to answer. I think that I wouldn't necessarily separate technological skills from other skills. And I also wouldn't say that as a recommendation to an employer would be not necessarily to assume that a younger person arriving is going to be a digital native, or that an older person who's arriving for an interview is necessarily a digital Luddite, somebody who knows nothing about technology, or is an assumption that they're not interested in technology. So I think it's avoiding making age-based assumptions about that person who's presenting for interview. So I mean that would be my immediate response to that question. And there's no doubt about it that many older workers have been left behind in recent years as technological change is advancing at such a pace. So it's important, I think, for governments and universities and colleges to consider what they can offer older people in terms of reskilling opportunities. We often tend to, Phyllis is much more expert than me on this, we think about education and training as being front-loaded. And what I mean by that is that's something that happens to you when you're young. Mm-hmm. You go to college when you're young, don't you? And we know that older workers are much less likely to go to college. So I think for governments and for colleges, they need to be thinking much more about what they can do to support workers as they age. So making that thing that we've talked about for many, many years, that thing lifelong learning, making that a reality. But also saying to older workers, you do need to invest in your skills. So, but I think it's probably a better, Phyllis is probably better able to answer this question than I am. Without,
Yeah, in one of our projects, we interviewed people across Europe and other parts of the world on what they lifelong learning opportunities. They offered people of all ages, and I felt like the Scandinavian countries were amongst the best at that. And I think in terms of creating a learning society where individuals understand the need to maintain skills and improve their skills throughout their life course, and that training just becomes a part of life. In Scandinavian countries, they have learning circles, they have a lot of adult education opportunities at little or no cost. I myself am a lifelong learner. It was 40 years between my undergraduate degree at Ohio State and my PhD at Miami, and it's just been a part of my life that I've just, and it wasn't that I was encouraged by my parents. I'm first generation college graduate, but it's something that I saw that I needed. That I had one career at Prudential where I had the same employer, but I had a lot of different jobs while I was there. And part of the reason I had those different jobs was I am a lifelong learner, and I made sure I had the skills that I could transition into something else when my job was eliminated.
It seems that the most important part of this conversation we've had, or a very important part of our conversation, is that the individual needs to take ownership of what they know and what they need to learn. But part of that also is to be excited about learning. I think that the folks that I worked with in my previous employment directing a nonprofit was that people had no incentive to learn new things over the time of their employment and didn't realize the need to keep learning, but then really weren't interested. They were sort of stymied because of having been not being in a learning environment, not understanding that it could be useful, not painful to be in a learning environment. So although an individual needs to take ownership, an employer or entity like higher education also needs to show how exciting learning can be. And I don't know that our educational institutions do that.
No, I think there's an assumption that education is a thing that happens to young people.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think as a society we stress enough the need for lifelong learning. And people often carry forward negative experiences of learning into adulthood.
Exactly.
And so they just put off the idea of going back to college. And I think for many older workers, particularly now, as the change is swirling all around us, it's hard to know how to go back to college. You're just struggling to make ends meet. You're paying your mortgage, and you want me to go to college as well.
Right.
And so how as a society do we enable older people to take some time out to go back to college, to get a degree, to change direction? And as a society, we've not worked this out yet, I think. As I said a few moments ago, learning's front loaded. You get it when you're young, generally. And it's disappointing because this debate's been going on for decades. This lifelong learning debate's been going for a long time. We've still not cracked that nut.
Absolutely. My 20 years in continuing education, we are farther behind now than we were then in terms of helping adults not just see education and higher ed learning as important and as fulfilling and as fun, but also to see that education can come in a lot of different forms, and it isn't just in a classroom getting a degree. There are other ways to do that. We could have another podcast just on that topic. So thank you both so much for everything that you have given us today. I hate to close this down, but my head's sort of spinning with all this information. One of the things, though, that we do really relish in our conversations with our guests is to give each of you an opportunity to give us your last words of wisdom. what would you like to make sure that our audience has heard from you today? Phyllis, maybe you'd like to start us out.
Sure. I'll go back to what I was just talking about, the importance of being a lifelong learner, and that adults of all ages need to understand that they're going to have a lot of different jobs and maybe even different occupations over their life course. And I think even more today than it was when I entered the workforce in 1973, that just technology changes and changes that we're a more global economy, that it's just so important to be a lifelong learner.
And if maybe going on from what Phyllis has just said a little bit, I think it's something I'm turning my attention to increasingly is the issue of socially disadvantaged older workers. There's much being said about the need for us to work for longer, to extend our working lives to the age of 70 or beyond. But I think there is still a significant group of older people in society for whom that's hugely challenging. And I think that's the public policy conundrum. What can we do with those workers? And I think there's a need for much greater attention to the challenges that they face.
Well, thank you to both of you. Yeah, many thanks to our guest experts, Dr. Phyllis Cummins from the Miami University Scripps Gerontology program, and Dr. Phillip Taylor, professor at the Institute of Employment Research at the University of Warwick in Coventry, England, for joining us today. Listeners, thank you for joining us. Check out our show notes on the website for contact information and the resources that we discussed today. You can find those details at lookingforwardourway.com. And we are looking forward to hearing your feedback on this or any of our other podcast episodes.